Since the European colonisation of Australia in 1788, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have faced a long history of oppression and marginalisation. Indigenous rights in Australia are the rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to self-determination, recognition of their culture, and access to lands, resources, and services. On May 26, 2017, Indigenous leaders from across Australia gathered at Uluru to draft the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The statement called for the Australian government to recognise their unique status in the country, and for the establishment of a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution and a Makarrata Commission to oversee the process of truth-telling and reconciliation. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was met with wide support from the public and from both sides of politics. But the government rejected the proposed amendments to the Constitution. The response to Indigenous rights in Australia has been largely lukewarm, with little action taken since the statement. In 2019, the Australian government introduced the Voice to Parliament Bill, which proposed the establishment of an Indigenous advisory body to the Parliament. This body would be made up of Indigenous representatives from each state and territory, and would advise the Parliament on Indigenous issues. While this bill has been welcomed by many, it does not go far enough to address the core issues of self-determination and recognition of Indigenous culture. In 2020, the Australian government announced the formation of the National Indigenous Australians Agency, which is tasked with developing a plan to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The agency has been allocated $7.3 billion over 4 years to fund initiatives such as housing, education, employment, and healthcare for Indigenous Australians. The agency is also responsible for developing a national agreement on native title, which would involve the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and the establishment of a Makarrata Commission. This commission would oversee a process of truth-telling, reconciliation, and treaty agreement making between Indigenous Australians and the government. While the government has taken some steps to address Indigenous rights, there is still much to be done. The Uluru Statement from the Heart called for recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and the establishment of a Makarrata Commission, both of which remain unaddressed. The Indigenous communities of Australia have been calling for self-determination and recognition of their culture for decades. It is time for the government to take action and implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This would be a powerful symbolic gesture of recognition and respect for Indigenous Australians and would help to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.